so nice when they include the English translation as part of the title of the game. Makes my life easier. Ginga Denshou is a mediocre game that happens to have a lot of interesting things around it. There's quite a few firsts here. And starting off with the big one, this is the first game that is known to have been developed by Atlus. Atlus acted as contract developers throughout the 1980s, taking commissions from publishers and making games to their requirements. So it's possible that there's another uncredited game out there, but as far as people know, this is the first. Atlus broke off of Tekken, who would become Tecmo, and Ginga Denshou was actually something that the team had been developing in their spare time, even before they founded Atlus. This was also the first game published by Imagineer. They were supposed to be developing home products and pivoted immediately into video games. Imagineer would go on to be a prolific, but kinda third-tier publisher. In the 90s, they'll publish hundreds of games. It's just that the most recognizable ones would be the Japanese versions of already popular games. Imagineer chose an interesting approach to make their games stand out on the shelves, and Ginga Denshou was the pilot of that. What they called the Wavejack line. Rather than the standard disk system packaging, Wavejack games came in an enormous, sturdy cardboard box, and the box slides open to reveal an enormous styrofoam block and a 144-page square-bound manual. There's also a sticker so you can put the Ginga Denshou logo on the outside of the packaging, an 18-page book on the educational principles underlying Imagineer's software, an advertisement for the Ginga Denshou soundtrack, and then finally, embedded in the styrofoam block, the game itself in a Famicom Disk System disc case, and a Ginga Denshou audio cassette, which has its own document in it. I'm going to get back to most of this in a second, but there's something important to mention here. This is absolutely absurd packaging. Ginga Denshou cost 5,000 yen when it was new. That's twice as much as Nintendo's Disk System games, and about what regular Famicom games were costing in 1986. One of the major selling points of the Disk System was cheaper games, and Imagineer managed to bump that price right back up by choosing the most expensive option possible for every step of this packaging. All of this effort on what turned out to be a mediocre game. The majority of that giant manual is a novella, guiding players through the premise and introducing them to the multinational space team that are the heroes of Ginga Denshou. Well, except for the fact that only one of them appears in the game. This is one of those games where somebody wrote a massive Bible for it, and only about 1/100th of it actually matters. Do you really need to know details about the biological functions of the aliens that you're shooting when all they do is walk towards you and shoot occasionally? As for the cassette, one of the goals of the Wavejack series was that these weren't just video games. They were multimedia extravaganza, or mixed media as they call it in the guidebook. So there's an elaborately produced audio drama that serves as the introduction to the game, even though there's a novella that serves as the introduction to the game. And this wasn't a cheapie that they knocked off real quick. The audio drama's cast are professional voice actors who, if you've ever watched Japanese animation, you've heard their voices in some kind of featured role. The whole idea is that you'd be absorbed in the Ginga Denshou universe. Run out and buy the album, which, by the way, doesn't contain game music. Build your Ginga Denshou models. Watch the eventual Ginga Denshou television series and movies. Ginga Denshou would be a franchise, and it would all start here. Here's a plot twist for you, it didn't really start. And that finally brings me to the game, Ginga Denshou. At least I got there before the 5-minute mark. The plot of the game is that in the distant future, the Earth is being ravaged by a plague that turns the infected into stone. However, alien writing gives clues to a solution. The planet Hope might have a cure, but to get to Hope, someone would have to collect a set of sacred treasures. And there's the plot of the game for you. You have to search a series of 5 planets, collecting a treasure from each of them. You also have to collect the coordinates to warp to the next planet. But there will be some things that you can't collect immediately, and so you'll wind up exploring, getting access to a new location, then doubling back when you've got something new to take there. And eventually, when you've collected everything, then you head to Hope. The game is divided into two sections: a space shooter and ground exploration. During the shoot-'em-up phase, you fight over randomly selected terrain, shooting down randomly selected enemies. The enemies come out in slow, simple waves of 2 to 4 craft each, and most of them take a real pounding from your guns before they go down. The A button fires your main weapon, and while there is an auto-fire, you're going to want to mash that button yourself. The B button fires your missiles, or as the game calls it, the cannon, but it has limited ammunition and you start with none. When you shoot down an enemy in this phase, they can drop one of 3 things. L, which restores some of your craft's energy, G, which is the currency, and this symbol, which is oxygen. Oxygen acts as a time limit during the planetary exploration phase, so you have to collect a lot of it during the shoot-'em-up sections before you land. If you shoot down enemy craft with a missile, then they'll drop a blue version of those, which gives you 5 times as much. Also during the shoot-'em-up phase, you can hit the start button to bring up a menu, and it has quite a bit of information. The alphabet soup on the left-hand side are which overhead regions you've visited, and if you've collected the password from those. On the right-hand side are your equipment stats, so how much gold you have, how many missiles you have, and the strength of different items. The warp in the bottom left will let you jump between planets, assuming you've collected all of the codes, and beside that are potions that can help you out. Potions are usable items that grant gold, life, or oxygen. As you're flying along, you'll see structures with a letter on them, and when you pass over these, you'll stop and be able to descend to the planet's surface. These letters are just as randomized as everything else in the space shooter, so if you're looking for a particular one, you could fly for quite a while before it comes up. After you run into the letter, hitting A will descend and B will cancel, but if you hit B, then you run into the letter again instantaneously and have to do it again. You also fire a missile when you do this, using up some of your precious ammunition. That's the other significant thing about Ginga Denshou. It's very poorly written. There are bugs everywhere here. You can't see your ship's health, for example. Or you'll get trapped in terrain by passing through things that you shouldn't. Or sometimes you won't be able to pass through things that you should be able to. The biggest problem with the game locking you out is that you can only save when you get a game over. So if you become trapped in terrain, you have to hit reset. And for that reason, you probably want to kill yourself before you go down to a planet. This way, if it does happen, you don't lose much progress. On the surface, you'll mainly explore vertically orientated halls, and occasionally there will be a path to the left or right that you can cross over. While walking around, the A button shoots, and the B button summons your spaceship. Useful because you are on a timer. That oxygen ticks down pretty fast, and you want it around 50 to be able to safely explore a region. Of course, that's only if you're moving through pretty quickly, which you probably should be. If you're poking around and exploring, you're probably going to need a lot more air than that. The monsters that you encounter on the planet can drop things besides the health, gold, and oxygen that you've already seen. They can also drop missiles and potions. Because you are on such a tight time limit, you don't want to try to grind for anything on the planet. Just shoot them if they're in your way, otherwise keep moving. You also can't access the sub-menu while you're on the planet, so you can't use the potions that you pick up until you get back to your ship. You'll also find caves that you can enter, and these can contain shops, where you have to buy all of your power-ups, or you might encounter a friendly alien who gives you a code. You might also find ancient writing, and this was one of the big features of Ginga Denshou. The idea was that you were supposed to use clues given to you in the manual and on the cassette tape to assemble an alien language so that you could interpret the messages that you would find around the game. Of course, these days, it's easier just to look up the solutions. And I'm sure that the people who played it back in 1986 probably just swapped answers on the playground rather than try to figure it all out. Another thing you can find while exploring the planets are these boss monsters. If you manage to defeat them, you'll get a permanent increase to your maximum health. When you're ready to head back into space, hit B to summon your ship, get in, and you're back at the shoot-'em-up section. Most of the game is going to be spent in the shoot-'em-ups, because you're going to need a lot of gold and a lot of oxygen, and that's really the only place that you can grind for it. And you're going to have to grind for a long time to get some of those power-ups. Some of the top-level items cost 8,000 G or more. That's a lot of spaceships you have to shoot down. Ginga Denshou sold about 100,000 copies at the time. To give you a little bit of context there, this was the very peak of the Famicom boom. You could fill a Famicom cartridge shell with dog crap and sell 500,000 copies. A few days after Ginga Denshou was released, the extremely similar Super Star Force was also released. Except that combination shoot-'em-up and exploration game played way better. Of course, Super Star Force was released by Tecmo, who Atlus broke off from. Well, there's no evidence of wrongdoing on either Atlus or Tecmo's part, but boy is that suspicious timing. Basically, a whole lot of stuff stacked up against Ginga Denshou, and 100,000 copies was a really underperforming game for 1986. In the hour that I played Ginga Denshou, I just about completed the first planet, and I was bored out of my skull. It was grind for 10 minutes to get enough oxygen to do an exploration section, then run through as fast as I could to grab the items that were there, but never really getting choked up by either the terrain or the enemies, and then repeat. There isn't anything interesting that you fight here. I never had to think, oh, how am I going to deal with that? I just ran past. It's a game where first you grind, and then you don't engage for a long time. That doesn't add up to be a very fun recipe.